Okay. So first, you may want to know a little bit more about me. As I said, my name is Ayana Olatunji. I have a bachelor's in creative writing from Loyola, and I got my graduate degree in education, English education, at the University of Florida. I also have a social media presence where I discuss a lot of elements of fashion history, sort of detail my journey in recreating all this clothing, and that is under the handle of the Vintage Guidebook. There we go. I am also, obviously, a big fan of Jane Austen's work. And as Andrea said, I used to teach English to middle and high school. So I have taught her novels several times. And the first the first question I got was, did people really talk like that? But the second question that I got was, did people really dress like that? And that was something that kind of spurred on my interest in sort of sharing that with other people, sharing the sort of ins and outs of the clothing of the period. Because as some of you may know, Hollywood gets it wrong pretty much all of the time. And I think that many of us would love to see as accurate as possible representation, but I do think there's so much creativity in the adaptations that are clearly meant to be more creative interpretations. I think both are fine. I love seeing it done either way, but I think when you're trying to portray a certain element of realism, whether yourself or whether in a film or TV adaptation, it is important to go over the elements that are accurate in history, because it will give you a better understanding of the period. As I've said, I am new to this myself as far as creating clothing. It has definitely made me a lot more sympathetic to Jane Austen's heroines in her novels that are sort of trapped with other people sewing this or that project. Not because sewing is, a terrible activity to be doing, not at all, but because it was very laborious before the sewing machine, and it presents many different challenges. As some of you who may know, doing hand sewing is absolutely not the same as doing machine sewing. I think that using clothing as a vehicle for exploration of any period, and in this case, Jane Austen's era, the Regency era, is a wonderful way to begin to understand her novels and her life as it was. It definitely gives you some insight. And anyone who is crafty, either making the costumes themselves, or if you'd like to purchase any ready-made to go to events, when it is safe to do so, can extremely benefit from it. So if you are like any of my students and would just like to know, okay, what was real, what's just Hollywood theater recreation, then this is the presentation for you. So this presentation will provide a very basic overview of the Regency era, the period during which Jane Austen wrote and lived. And will address common myths, misrepresentations, and provide suggestions as to how you can create a historically accurate look, whether you are sewing or buying, if you would like it to be accurate at all. As I've said, both representations have their merit. I certainly would never say that any adaptation or stage reproduction or anything like that is, if it's inaccurate, it's wrong, it's bad. Not at all. It's just another take. But if you would like to know the accurate take, then we are going to discuss that here. And I have a note regarding gender throughout this presentation. Just for the sake of time and historical context, I will be referring to this clothing as menswear and women's wear, but of course, in the 21st century, we do understand that there are absolutely more than two genders, and no matter how you choose to identify, please wear whatever Regency clothing you desire. You don't have to wear a specific type of clothing just based off of these 18th and 19th century gender constraints. By all means, please feel free to wear what you like, but I am just here to show you those representations as they would have understood it, as Regency people would have understood them. So, what is the Regency era? Well, it was an era of time so called for the Prince Regent of England, George IV, who is pictured here on your should be left, who ruled in the place of King George III of England, who suffered from ill health. And for anyone wondering, that King George III was the one who famously lost the American colonies. So the whole reason that America does not have its own Regency era is because we had just broken away from England. So that was his fault. It technically began in 1811, but if we're talking fashion-wise, we do start to see a shift from the majority of the 1700s. We start to see that shift around the 1780s, 1790s. So fashion-wise, I would say 1790s to 1820s. That is what most historians typically agree for the fashion, but it did not technically begin until the Prince Regent assumed power in 1811 and then ended when Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837. It's also known by other names, the Federalist period here in America, Directoire in France. But I think for most people outside of history fields, it is highly associated with Jane Austen and her novels. Jane Austen was born in 1775, a very important date for all of us Americans here. Not so much in England, though. She was a young woman in the 1790s, so right about the beginning of the Regency, the shift in fashion in the Regency period. Pride and Prejudice was published in 1813, so we're talking smack dab in the middle of the period. And then Jane Austen tragically died young in 1817. So these dates are largely what people think of when they think of the Regency era. They think of the time that Jane Austen's most popular novels were published. So even though Sense and Sensibility was written in the 1790s, it was published in 1811. So a lot of the depictions that you see on stage or on TV and film are going to be reflective of that 18-teens look. And we can see Jane Austen here herself represented in that fashion of the high ample waist, right? We have short sleeves, usually puffed or something like that. We have the hair up and we have some curls or fringe kind of happening. And we have these nice pastel colors. The Regency is very known for that. We will talk about whether or not that's actually true. Please also keep in mind this image of the Prince Regent on your left. He's very important. We will come back to him later. So how did we go from clothing like this here depicted in the 1700s. The vast majority of the 1700s until you get to about the 1780s looked something like this. I'm sure we've all seen images that look something like this in other historical periods and other maybe historical dramas that we've watched, right? So we've all seen this. For those of us here today from America, I'm assuming most of us, but this is typically identified as the era of George Washington, right? So we've all seen this before. Please do note the low-cut bust lines on the women's wear, and please do note the amount of lace in the men's wear. Those two things in particular are very standout details of the 1700s, of the majority of the 18th century. So how did we get to this? How do we get to the Regency period where we're seeing very different silhouettes? We're seeing different colors, different shapes. Where has all the lace gone? So it's a very different silhouette in, as I said before in the previous slide, a very short amount of time. So let's talk about that. And here are the two fashions represented together. So on the left, we have here the new, for the period, Regency fashions. And on the right here, we have the older 1700s, 18th century fashions. And on the bottom there's a little caption. I will paraphrase. It's written in French. And on the left, this couple is looking and saying, oh, how old? And on the right, they are saying, oh, how ridiculous, these new fashions, paraphrasing. So that can tell you that we're seeing very different shapes here. So if we look to the left, the woman's dress here is looks like white, very lean, very slender, right? On the right, we have the woman with these very large, wide skirts, lots of trimming, lots of bows, lots of lace, just so much going on there. We see the gentleman on the left with a very, I would say, muted palette, right? Looks like olive green or beige, maybe khaki colored ensemble here with his bicorn hat. We have the 2 points, right? And then on the right, we have the gentleman in, it looks like maybe a brocade or silk jacket and suit underneath. We see a lot of embroidery there on the cuffs, on the neckline. There's a lot of detail there, right? So we're seeing a lot more happening on the right than you might think initially looking at the left. Okay, so how did we get there though? So if we're going to sort of say the Regency period in fashion started in the 1790s, well, the 1780s was a period that saw some changes in fashion and society. So we have on the right here, Marie Antoinette of France and the chemise à la reine portrait. This was done in 1783. And for those of you who are up on your history, you know that in 1789, the French Revolution really began in full swing. So we have some context for that, right? So here we have this dress on the French Queen that could not look more different from the image we just saw, the woman in the blue and pink dress, correct? With all that lace, all those bows, all that trim. This, relatively speaking, of course, looks plainer, right? It's white. We can see sort of a sash in the back. She has a hat. But that appears to be about it, right? Well, absolutely. And this caused a lot of scandal at the time. we definitely saw a societal transition to simpler clothing. The French Revolution, and we have those dates down there, the Napoleonic Wars, and return to nature movements were all kind of simultaneously happening in Europe at this time, particularly Western Europe, although it did reach elsewhere. This dress caused so much scandal. Uh, Everyone thought it was too plain for a queen, um, even though to our eyes, of course, and I believe it was silk, we wouldn't say so. But at the time, right, compared to what we saw before in the previous slide, you would only see a white dress like this used as undergarments or perhaps worn by children, something like that, because white was thought to represent innocence at the time, and so it was easier for children to wear something like that. But a grown woman would not have worn a plain white dress. That was underwear. And so it caused a big scandal because people said she was not appropriately dressed for a queen, right? It was undignified. It was indecent, even. And of course, people thought because it was so casual, so informal, that it was so inappropriate. It looked like it could be easily slipped on, or perhaps more notably, slipped off, that it was just absolutely inappropriate for a queen to wear. So of course, after that, everyone wanted one, and it did definitely started a new fashion, along with the other movements that I have mentioned. And by the way, this portrait actually had to be redone because it had so much of a negative response. And she was fully clothed in the second one, but of course the damage was done. Okay. And as for neoclassicism, so we also have, in the midst of all this return to nature, things like that, we had a return to the classics. And by classics, I mean it in the sense that Regency people would have understood it. Ancient Rome, ancient Greece, that kind of a thing. There was a rekindled interest in Greek and Roman literature, culture, architecture. You often think about Georgian architecture, a lot of those columns, right? And very symmetrical. Well, that does come from Greek and Roman architecture as well. So we see women's clothing first becoming much more drapey, much more flowy. We see lighter fabrics coming into use. We see men's clothing becoming tighter. Hang on, I've lost my mouse for a second. There we go. Okay. With the goal of, for both genders, to look as tall and as much like a Greek statue as possible. So very understated. We start losing all of those trimmings, all of those decorations. So when thinking about your own costume, that's really the silhouette you want to go for. You want to be very tall, very subtle. So instead of taking up space to show how much power and wealth you had, instead of showing off literally all of your wealth on your clothing, it got simpler and simpler, and it began to show off your body, right? So your body was doing the talking. We start to see that happening more and more. Where if you have the right physique, you must have also the right social class. So don't worry, it was still important to be rich. We're not letting go of that, but it was now considered, not tasteful to show it. Now it was more about the body. Your body would show what class you belong to. Unlike the, relatively speaking, squatter, heavier styles of the 1700s. And particularly, I do want you to note that there was very little decoration, particularly early in the era. Again, remember, if the Regency period really kicks off sartorially in the 1790s, That's coming right on the heels of the French Revolution. You, as an aristocrat and one of the gentry, right, would not want to look anything like the French rulers and nobility. You want to distance yourself as much as possible and say, nope, nope, that's not me. I don't know them. So you wanted a definite contrast. But here's something interesting. Picture on the left looks very much like a typical Regency gown, doesn't it? We definitely see some Indian and other Asian influences in English Regency era clothing, and this is of course due to imperialism. There was more and more influence, especially in India, by this period. We're really starting to see England assert its dominance in that area. And because of that, there was rampant cultural appropriation, taking a lot of elements from Asian dress and using them in English clothing. So many people have noted this, most notably dress historian Hilary Davidson in her book, Dress in the Age of Jane Austen, that, quote, classicism in dress may have been equally an East Indian Orientalism in dress, end quote, noting that the trend for high-waisted, short-sleeve gowns with relatively tighter sleeves of cotton muslin looked very much like the contemporary styles in what is now a little bit north of Pakistan today. Okay. And moving this. This directly coincides with the rise of cotton as the dominant textile. Before the Regency period, you would see linen or wool as the dominant fabrics. Cotton was still pretty expensive. You couldn't get cotton very cheaply, even for the upper classes before this period. And of course, silk. We always have silk. But cotton starts to kind of take over as it gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper throughout this period. As opposed to the traditional English linen. This is directly related to England's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, given that the profit margin for slaveholders was so high, it brought down the price of cotton to make it affordable across all classes in England by the end of this period. And increasingly, England began to rely on exploited Indian labor to replace that demand for cotton fabric once the abolitionism movement became on the rise only a few decades later. So cotton was here to stay. And one note on that. So we don't want to recreate the rampant cultural appropriation of the Regency era, right? So when you are selecting your costuming fabrics, by all means, do choose cotton, but you want to be very careful if you want to select a fabric for a sari dress, so-called because they mimic the fabric and print styles of an Indian sari. Please Google your fabric choice first to make sure that it is not in any way a sacred fabric that you, of course, would not want to cut into. Okay, so by the 1790s, we're seeing a very clear silhouette emerge. We've seen a lot of white coming in and out. We've seen a lot of simpler designs, but in 1790, we start getting a very clear shift in silhouette. As we can see on the left here, this image of Prince Victor Henri Christophe of Haiti and Princesses Amethyst and Athénère. Please forgive my very badly accented French. But we can see here both menswear and women's wear Regency ideals displayed. We see in menswear, very simple, right? We see in women's wear a lot of white, looks like pastel blue, pastel pink. We see the hair up. We see that the fringe and curls around the top. We see the very simple headband, right? So simplicity and symmetry is starting to become a theme. We're not seeing so much stuff on people. We're seeing the body sort of do the talking. And we're definitely seeing military wear here in menswear influences, right? We're not seeing, the clothes aren't as pretty, in my opinion, but they are sort of saying, hey, I have military prowess. Um, and we can see that both here. Okay, and we also see that change in fabrics I mentioned, right? So we're not seeing a lot of heavy brocades, velvets, silks. Of course, these are still going to be used, especially when we're talking evening wear or court dress, which we'll get to later. But typically, we're seeing a move away from all that. To definitely get that flow, right? Remember, we're trying to look like a Greek statue here. So with the clothes sort of billowing in the wind. So we want everything to be airy. We want it to have movement. White was a very popular color choice by the upper classes because it was intended to mimic those statues. We know today that they were not white, but back then they didn't know that. So they thought, okay, this will help me look more like that. But also other lighter pastel shades were popular too, which was very different from the period before it. Menswear became slimmer, plainer, as we've discussed. Minimal trimming on both. And if you notice, no wigs. So that is the main thing that I remember my students always asking me about when they would look at this period and go, "Oh, that's that old people stuff. I don't understand the wigs." And I said, "Well, good news. There are no wigs in this period, except for very formal occasions." All right, so let's start from the inside out with women's wear and undergarments. Here's a picture of me. And speaking of all that cotton, it started right here. So both genders wore stockings, but that is where it split. So right here we have a shift and stays, not a corset. We're not saying that yet. And some more. And here is everything that would go on before we even get to a dress. You have your chemise, that was the French word that they started using instead of shift, but it's essentially the same garment here. You can see that I'm wearing on the right, and then in this image in the middle, that would kind of be the equivalent of a slip today. So you would put that on first, and that is to protect you from your clothes. So a lot of people always ask about all the layering that it takes to go into one of these outfits. Well, you're not really touching your clothes though. So we have a lot of layers before your sweat, bodily oils, all of that fun stuff even gets to your clothes. You have stockings and then the garters to hold them up. Remember, elastic does not exist yet, so they're just ribbons most of the time. Your shoes, and then a petticoat would go on over that. For warmth, remember, we're talking about England, so it's quite cold. There we go. Keep losing my mouse. Sorry about that. So here is a photo of what a Regency petticoat would look like. This was a change because, as you can see, it begins right under the bust, right, and just has straps. You could also find examples of these that do have a bodice attached. But this was a big deal because everything starts moving upward, right? We're still going for that tall, lean silhouette. So everything had to come up, even your petticoats. And a note on drawers for this period, there weren't any. How we understand underwear today, panties, all of that. Nope, none of it. So there's that. Pretty much if you're talking about underwear, Regency people would have understood that to mean your stays or your shift. That's what they would think of if you said, oh, this person wasn't dressed. They were, only in their undergarments. And just another note on stays. We learned in last year's JASNA AGM from a presentation by Kristen Miller-Zone and Mackenzie Schultz that stays, which are not yet the corset, remember, did not pull in at the waist. That is very important. You will see over and over again in Hollywood depictions, someone, pulling very tightly on an upper class woman trying to get that waist cinched in, right? Got to pull those strings. That was literally impossible during this period because they were not strong enough to handle that kind of strain. Remember, this is before the sewing machine, so we don't have metal grommets, we don't have metal boning or anything like that. So it would literally tear the stays apart if you tried to tighten them. That is pure fiction. Now, for your own costuming, you don't need to wear stays. I understand that they're still quite pricey even today. That's not accessible for everyone. If you can get your hands on one, I do recommend it. It definitely puts you in mind for the era, and also moves the bust where it should be, if you get my meaning. But if you cannot, a push-up bra that fits very well will also do the trick. All right, and menswear. So same thing, we start with, instead of a shift or chemise for men, we start with a shirt, stockings, shoes, and breeches, which could also be pronounced breeches. Those are the pants of the era. And we get to cravat and collar. And we start seeing the rise of the dandy. Now, this is very important for menswear. We have a lot of white. So we go from these very frilly, very lacy jabot collars of the 1700s into a plain white rectangle of cloth in the Regency period. They were usually white, by the way. Remember, lots and lots of white for the upper classes, because white was very hard to keep clean. So again, remember, the stuff on your clothes isn't showing off your wealth, but you in your clothes is showing off your wealth. And as we can see in this image here on the right, the points of that shirt collar, you see they're very wide here, and they are going to go up to surround the neck. So with all of this, your body showing off your wealth, your body showing off how, socially desirable you are, we start seeing the rise of the dandy or the fop, either of those terms. This is a guy who is very into his clothes, right? Very into looking good. He spends more time on his hair than women do, that kind of a thing. This, of course, has existed pretty much since the beginning of time. But in the Regency, we start seeing people more aware of it, and people kind of poke fun at it, saying that men should be doing more important things with their time. And this is directly in contrast to pretty much everything that came before, right? We have Louis XIV just a century or two before, where everyone just hung on his every move. Anything he put on was just oh so wonderful, oh so amazing. Everyone wanted to look like him. Well, remember, post revolution, we start seeing the opposite. So paying so much attention to your clothing and everything is not good for both genders, but particularly in men. This starts to kind of become a negative. And like most things, even though it's a negative, everyone wanted to do it. So we definitely start seeing more attention paid by men as to how they look. Maybe because of all that attention being on your body now. So maybe when you have more people looking at you, you start to become more aware, right? Men would sometimes even wear corsets in order to get that athletic Greek Roman statue body, right? You've seen a lot of uh, those statues in the nude, right? The Roman athlete, the Greek athlete. So men were going for that look, even under their clothes, even though, you know, we have a lot of layers still during this period. But they wanted to look like, okay, maybe underneath, that's how they looked. So we start seeing the body more representative of masculinity as opposed to how many things you have on you. Also, no drawers, no underwear as we know it today, no boxers, no briefs, none of that. Okay, and speaking of all of that new masculinity and menswear, remember that portrait I showed of the Prince Regent? Well, this is a little bit closer to what he actually looked like. If anyone recalls the nursery rhyme, Georgie Porgy, first couple of lines, Georgie Porgy pudding and pie, kissed the girls and made them cry. That was about him. He was not particularly well liked in his time. He was, in fact, overweight, had a little bit of a penchant for wine, food, and the ladies. Not exactly mutual relationship, but he was popular enough, we'll put it that way. This is a direct, again, contrast from that Versailles era that was kind of nipped in the bud once you had the French Revolution, the rise of Napoleon, all of these things. So now instead of a king that everyone is trying to look like, everyone is trying to look very much the opposite. You did not want to be in any way similar to this king. So now everyone's definitely trying to look slim and tall and muscular because, yes, it's the new ideal, but also you don't really want to look like the king, not in this period. So this definitely spurred menswear into the opposite direction. We start seeing darker colors in over the white. So, you know, darker jackets, darker, you know, coats, sleek lines. This is where you see the rise of tailoring, right? So we start seeing clothes more fitted to the body for men. Women's wear is supposed to look very flowy, very drapey. Menswear is the opposite. We want it to be as tight to the body as possible because we want everyone to see those muscles, right? And also, you don't want to look like the king. Well, Prince Regent, excuse me. Okay. And for example, as we can see here in this portrait of Sake Din Muhammad, the founder of the Hindustani Coffee House, the very first Indian restaurant in England, he has the new Regency masculinity look, right? He's got a very closely fitted jacket. We can see that because we can see his outline even as he sits here. Right? We don't see any belly. Contrast that to the image of the Prince Regent in the background, right? With the new Regency clothing, you couldn't see a men's belly. So that might have been very helpful for some people who were trying to hide it. We see he's got the white cravat and white collar, right? Not a lot of ornamentation. He's got his gloves there, also white, showing that, you know, he's doing pretty well. Somebody to be paid attention to. And we see it again over here in this image from a fashion plate. Please note the tightness of the pants there. We can see his muscles, right? We can see those calves. We can see the knees, the thigh. We can see a lot, actually. I don't think we see that much today in menswear. And he also has the same. He has that high collar, not a whole lot going on at the neck, and his jacket is very fitted. We can easily see the outline of his body there. All right, and for day wear with women's wear, women were a lot more covered up than most fictional representations show us today. You can see in all the examples on the right here that low necklines were still quite popular, carryover from the 1700s. But please note, these were always filled in. These were always covered up in the daytime. Excuse me. Women would have a fichu, which was a rectangular piece of cloth covering up the neckline, and increasingly a little bit more in fashion, we would see the chemisette. That is this garment here all the way on the left of all the images with that ruffle at the top, and that I am wearing today. So these could look very different, but they were always covering up the neckline. If you'll notice in the images here, as well as my outfit, well, what we can see from the waist up, the necklines were quite low, but they were always filled in. Dresses were typically fastened by pins or drawstrings or tapes in the front to make a bib or apron front, as it was called. There were buttons where the dress would button up the back, but this was relatively uncommon, particularly in the early period. As we move forward, it does become more and more common. But think about that for 1 second. If your dress buttons up the back, you are absolutely going to need help getting into it. So that was one factor. Also, buttons were sort of associated with masculinity. You would only see buttons in menswear prior to this period. So for a woman to wear buttons was very different and a little bit masculine. The sleeve length could vary. You could see very short sleeves, puff sleeves. 3/4 sleeves were very popular as a carryover again from that 1700s silhouette, which was very helpful throughout periods, right? So throughout seasons. So if we're talking winter, you can easily just do long gloves and you're still getting that arm length there, warmth there, as well as in the summer. Dresses had very long trains until about 1806. And believe me, it was just as inconvenient then as it would be now, if not more so. We have a quote here. In the morning, the arms and bosom must be completely covered to the throat and wrists. From the dinner hour to the termination of the day, the arms to a graceful height above the elbow may be bare, and the neck and shoulders unveiled as far as delicacy will allow. From the Mirror of the Graces, written by a lady of distinction in 1811. So this is all to say that women were very covered up in the daytime. It was considered very inappropriate to bare any part of your chest or arms during the day. In public, however, you would always wear a bonnet, a hat, a cap, a turban, something, and a jacket or coat. We see in the image on the right, she has a short Spencer jacket and a matching bonnet. You could also do a wool shawl, influence from India. So you see a lot of shawls from this period onward. Before that, women would have a triangular shawl, not the long rectangular ones. The slippers were quite plain in this period. We're not seeing those heavy buckle boots. Sorry, not boots, but buckle shoes. Boots were actually quite discouraged for women during this period. Again, a little too masculine, not quite comfortable with that, although they did exist. The hair was always covered. I think that's the thing I want to emphasize here. You would never ever see a woman out with her hair uncovered. That was for children or sex workers. Past 30, and that was considered quite old in the Regency era. We have to remember the the life expectancy was not that long. Women were encouraged to cover up even at home, to cover their hair with a cap or something like that. But also they would have been drawn to this, right? Remember that healthcare is not what it is today. Hair loss for women was very common, balding, also hair going white prematurely, things like that. So women were, older women were pretty keen to not have anyone know that. So the cap wasn't the punishment you might think. Loose hair would absolutely mean that you're a social pariah. It would not have been acceptable by any means. As the Regency tailor Jack Pinsent once said in a presentation on Regency dress, quote, "That's one of the ways a woman of questionable virtue might signal that she was available," end quote. Loose meant literally loose. A loose woman meant a woman with loose hair. All right, so women's wear in Hollywood pretty much breaks all the rules that we have talked about, and that's okay, that's fine. But it is something to note when you are thinking about, if you do want to do a little bit more of an accurate costume. We can see here, Hollywood tends to throw out the fichus and chemisettes, right? No one here has their chest covered. They all look beautiful. I love all of these gowns, and I wish I had them. We also see a lot of the time in Hollywood uncovered heads in public. We see no bonnets, no caps. And we also see loose hair quite a bit. We see a lot of our leading ladies with their hair down, blowing in the wind as they, stand out over the moors or something. It's very beautiful. It's a lovely take, but they absolutely would have had you committed back then for doing it. And a little white dress, as Hilary Davidson words it in her book. This was common for anyone who could afford to have it. So we see it in so many different variations. It was popular by women of all ages, again, who were of a high enough social class that they could pull it off. Remember, white is very hard to keep clean back in these days before paved roads. Just going on a short trip around the corner would absolutely dirty your gown for days and days until you could get to another laundry day. So this was a huge signaler that, hey, I have money and I either have the time to sit around and do nothing but laundry, or more likely, I have someone who I can pay to do that for me. All right, and menswear, we're still seeing breeches very early on in the period, so they come down to the knee and then fasten there, and we have those stockings, right? But we start to see them in more neutral tones, so we're not seeing any of these bright turquoise suits that we've seen in the 1700s. But gradually they get phased out and we move to pants. That's a big deal. We have not seen pants in England until about probably the Roman period by the actual Britons. Men always wore a vest. This could be plain or it could be print. Print was starting to get a little bit more popular. We're seeing a lot more toned down though. So we're seeing that shift from all that ornamentation. Pants start really coming into their own around 1815-ish and pretty much took over by the 1820s, except evening wear. And we're going to come to that in a moment. Remember, again, these were very, very tight. If you are doing a menswear look, pretty much the tighter the better, excuse me. I haven't seen anyone go for it, so I really want to see that. Another option might be Russian Cossack trousers, which were very loose. And of course, that would be better if you were actually in the military or doing heavy labor to allow freedom of movement. They all had pockets. So pretty much we women have been forced to deal with the no pocket problem about this period onwards. I just want to emphasize that again. The tightness is absolutely real. We see this image here, this guy. We're seeing a lot of what nature gave him. And that was considered perfectly fine. That was considered very masculine, you know, to kind of show off. Remember, we're trying to show off that muscular body. As we can see in some of the images before, military dress is starting to become more acceptable socially. Of course, we've always had soldiers, but now we can wear our uniforms out, right? That's a big thing in Jane Austen's novels. All the different soldiers that we see in her novels, some are really nice guys, some are really horrible guys, but either way, we start to see more of them in England, and they can wear their uniforms just around town. Whereas before, that was considered very inappropriate, very tacky. Now it's very masculine, you know, you're very much socially acceptable. But showing the shirt was not. Men would never, ever show their shirts. So unfortunately, our lovely wet Darcy probably wouldn't have happened. Sad, sad, but true. But we definitely can see here in public, and of course paintings don't count as public, that's kind of how you can get around some of those social rules. You would always wear a hat outside. To not do so would have been seen as at best inappropriate, but more likely socially deranged. There are no sexual connotations for going hatless for men, but it is considered very inappropriate, showing disrespect. So we can see that, but we do see the bicorn coming in. So we can see on this image all the way on the right, again, that military influence. So sometimes you might see a man wearing just plain country dress, but he's got the bicorn hat. So he's still saying, you know, I'm not a soldier, but I could be. I'm just as tough as one. And same thing with sportswear, country wear. So again, those plainer colors we talked about, that was typically only worn in the countryside in the 1700s, 18th century, because of course you're riding horses, you're out in the rain, you're walking across these fields, your clothes are going to get very dirty. So you didn't want to wear your nice silks, you wanted to wear, you know, greens, blues, blacks. But now that's cool. It's cool to wear it. So that becomes very, very, very popular. It also shows you can afford to have a country house. So there's that. And riding boots as well become popular as day wear. Again, even for men who are not soldiers, they are starting to take these bits of military dress and wear them. In Hollywood, we see it all the time, right? So I want to point out on the right here, we have two different examples of the same actor. I believe this is from Pride and Prejudice, 2005. This was absolutely swoon-worthy. Every girl was looking at soldiers and going, oh, he's so cute, he's so tough, he's so manly. So the idea of wearing your military clothes pretty much anywhere was definitely a ticket to having guys want to be you, women wanting to be with you. So of course, any young guy would absolutely do it. And if he wasn't a soldier, he probably borrowed a friend's jacket a couple of times. In Hollywood, we also see a little bit more casual. So all the way on the left here, we have, you know, the shirt open at the throat, wandering around with no hat, very romantic, very brooding, also very uncharacteristic. This probably wouldn't have happened, but it's a lovely look. I love it. We also see lower collar points. We saw the images from the period, right, with those collar points kind of right at the jaw. You almost never see this in Hollywood. So if you are doing your own costume and you want to look very different, very unique, I say go for it. Make that collar right where it would have been, right on the side of your face. It's a look. It's definitely a look. Evening wear. For women, remember the rule about being covered and not showing cleavage with that low neckline, not showing arms. Take all that and throw it out of the window. This was the time where it was absolutely acceptable to have, I mean, a neckline that could really just poke an eye out. Remember, this period had very sharp definitions of what was appropriate when and where, and this was the time to show everything you have. It was commented on even at the time that fabrics were too sheer, that you could see the breasts that were now, you could see them more now anyway with the new style that promoted a high bust, rounded, separated, very much a 1950s lift and separate. In fact, Marilyn Monroe definitely had a Regency silhouette. Because the breasts were not considered the sexually suggestive zone that they are today. That was definitely arms, and you absolutely had to wear elbow length gloves for an evening wear look. Again, we see that image of that young woman at the piano. Painting doesn't count. If you're having a portrait done, doesn't count. But for any woman of the period, you can see the woman in the red dress below. She's holding her gloves, and on the mannequins there, they all have gloves on, probably placed by the curator. You could get away with heavier fabrics for evening, so you might see some silk, but not too much, right? We're not trying to show off yet. That's still don't want to do that. A little too close to the revolution. And they do start to become more trimmed as the period goes on. For young women, pastels are very popular. For older women, bolder colors. This wasn't a hard rule, but it would have been strongly sought after. It would have been very odd for, say a 17-year-old having her first season to wear a bright red dress. Not a rule, but very uncommon. Hair being uncovered was perfectly fine for evening. For practical reasons, right? You can't really dance with all that on your head, but also this was a time to kind of show off your fancy new hairstyle. But typically women would have flowers. If you were of the appropriate class, you could have a tiara, something like that. So hair usually wasn't completely bare, but no hats, no bonnets. Again, we see finer fabrics still. We're not really going back to the heaviness of the previous era. Slips with a sheer overlay became very popular during this period. You might have a dress that was a solid, and instead of buying a whole new dress, you would just get an overlay that might be organza, that might have some trim, something like that. So that's a wonderful option if you only care to buy or make one dress. Just get some sheer fabrics and you can definitely, take that one dress a lot further with your own costuming. Actual feathers and fruit were also very popular to put in the hair. You see here an older woman. She has what looks like a satin or silk dress, but she's still quite covered, right? And for menswear, we're still seeing those solid colors. We're not seeing the embroidery and decoration that we saw before, but we could get a little bit of a sheen to the fabric. So we could do satin, maybe something like that. That was about as adventurous as they got. Gloves are required. Again, we don't want bare hands to touch. Who knows what that might lead to. No hats again, but men tended to use their hats as a fashion statement. They would sort of carry them around, I guess, just to show, hey, I do have a hat. It's quite expensive. And especially if you were a man who if you were a soldier or maybe just wanted people to think you had a bicorn hat, you'd sort of carry it around looking very much like Napoleon. Well, not like Napoleon, remember this is the English, but still giving off the effect of, hey, I could be someone very important. Again, military uniforms were acceptable now. You could wear them to a ball. Before, that would have been a huge social faux pas. Absolutely not. But now it's very trendy, very sexy. Same thing with the shoes, except you would not wear boots. So we're doing the same shoes. You have your breeches, your stockings, and then slippers. But you would never, ever wear boots. Not to say that people didn't, they absolutely did, but this was considered very impolite. And we see here 2 images of evening wear. I would like you to especially note on the left how low those necklines were. We can see quite a bit from the ladies. This was totally fine for evening. And then on the right here, we can see the menswear. We're not seeing a lot of color, right? But we are seeing military uniforms. It looks like one fellow here has the boots still on. Both of those men came in uniform. The boots are a little bit of a faux pas, but the officer in the yellow, I would wear those boots too, everywhere. As far as the working class, they tried to copy the upper classes as much as they could within reason. And by working class, I do not mean merchant class. I don't mean people who have shops. I mean people doing the heavy labor that supported the lives of the gentry during this period. Servants, farmers, the enslaved, those types of people. So we're not seeing much white, right? So the white that we do see in working class people comes in head wraps, comes in the fichus, comes in aprons, right? We're seeing that in this image below here. And then the one in the middle right, you're not going to see a lot of white, obviously. Darker colors are more common. They don't show dirt and soot and things like that. Prints and patterns, especially mismatched, were much more common for working class people. That was the way that you could get your look to be a lot more exciting, right? Because you're not having, organza overlays of your over your dress. You can't afford that, but you can mix and match. And here are some more examples here, so we can kind of see what I'm talking about there. So we see something very interesting too with women's wear in this image here. Hope you guys can see the mouse in the middle. These women are wearing not gowns, but a petticoat skirt with a short jacket over it. This garment pretty much gets ignored in most Austen depictions because it's not something the gentry and upper classes would have worn in public. This was a casual outfit. This was a little bit similar to a robe for the upper classes. But of course, for working class people, this was a great way to reuse clothing from the 1700s, right? You just kind of add some extra material to your petticoat, you can tie it under the bust, make a quick jacket, and you're done. Very easy to keep up with the fashion without a whole lot of effort. No high collars for men. You can't see any especially high collars here, obviously, because that impedes movement. So working class men would not have done that, but they still would have worn a type of scarf in place of a cravat, just to show, again, they're respectable, that they're on trend. So that's also an approach you could take. Head coverings were very much in place by the working class, who would not have had balls or anything like that to go to, for one, but also were probably outside a lot more than their upper class counterparts, right? They need that protection from the sun, the rain. Also, they are probably not able to access the ability to wash their hair as much. So this was key, actually. And also of note, since we are in the Louisiana region, in the book An Agreeable Tyrant, historian Alden O'Brien notes that recent evidence suggests that the head wrap worn by enslaved women of the African diaspora does not seem to be heavily in use until European contact. Not to say that some cultures did not wrap their hair, of course they did, but it doesn't have the almost majority prevalence that it does when you start seeing enslaved people in the Caribbean, here in the United States. And perhaps this could be purely utilitarian, but it did, especially in Louisiana, become a badge of pride once you have the Tignon laws that dictate that women, enslaved women, could not bear bare heads. They had to have their hair covered. So in sort of that perfectly ironic way that history has, women just got more creative with their head wraps. Putting together your own look I have assembled here some depictions in the present day that can serve as examples for your own costume. Please note, not all of these are accurate. And again, that's okay. The point is to take some of the elements from the period and use them to create a look that you like, that you think represents your needs and the event that you're attending. As Jane Bolts noted in her own presentation on Regency dress in the Jasna Southwest region, there are a lot of pros and cons to consider when creating your own costume, namely to sew or to buy. Even if you are able to sew, sewing historical dress is much different from sewing contemporary clothing. It's a very different skill set, and not everyone feels the need to take it on, as well as some people who neither have the time nor the skill to sew. I will have a shopping list that we can send out for a variety of shops, some that offer sewing implements, some that offer commissions or ready-made. But as you can see, accessories make the difference. Every image here has a key Regency accessory, whether it's a headpiece of some sort, whether it's gloves, a shawl, whether it's the type of print, right? Accessories will take you a long way. And again, I will have lists of places, but please be advised that no matter what you choose to do with your costume, the most important thing is that it's representative of something you want to wear. It does not have to be accurate. This is an example of the further reading and shopping list that I would be happy to, along with Andrea's help, send out for anyone who needs ideas, where to buy things, or how can you learn more about Regency dress. And I would like to say a heartfelt thank you for being here today, as well as Andrea for hosting. And also, I believe we can open it up for some questions.
You want to just take the questions orally versus using the chat?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I have not been monitoring the chat at all. Let me get out of screen.
So does anybody have any questions for Ayana? Put it on gallery here. Oh, no, okay. Okay, you got it on gallery. Okay. Let's see. Looks like Rosemary has a question.
Yeah, this is not a question, it's just a comment. The painting of Marie Antoinette in the white dress by Vigée Lebrun.
Mm-hmm.
The New Orleans Museum of Art has a very large portrait of Marie done by Vigée Lebrun, but it was a sort of a propaganda piece that was, the short version is it was painted under the influence of her mother, who was the Empress of Austria, the Austrian Empire. And they wanted her to look regal but approachable. And in that beautiful painting, she's wearing fabrics, velvets and veils that are so delicate, you feel as if you could practically touch them. I mean, the fabric, it's a completely different look than the one you showed us, but it was a portrait at a different time. It was about maybe 5 years before she was executed, and it was done for a different purpose, but by the same artist, which I thought was interesting. It looks completely different.
Yeah,
Completely different.
absolutely.
So those of you who are in New Orleans, if you are out at NOMA, go up to the second floor, and in the French Gallery, you can see it up there.
Any other questions? Well, I have a question. Yana, did you make the dress that you have on right now?
I did, yes.
Including the chemisette and the undergarments?
I did not make the chemisette. This was purchased. I did make the dress though, and this is out of a lightweight wool.
Oh, so it's wool, huh?
It
Okay.
is, yes.
Yeah, okay. Anybody, any other questions?
Oh, I see a
Yeah,
hand raised.
Maria. Just unmute. There you go.
Hi. I in the beginning you said to be careful about using a religious sari dress, and I wonder if you can explain the difference between the different saris. So I'm more aware of that. I'm not doing a cultural appropriation thing.
Unfortunately, that's not really my area. I don't know as much about the different types. I do know that in several dress historian groups, there are some historians who specialize in that who might be able to tell what are the different ones. But if you can take a picture or if you know the name of the fabric, if you just type that into Google, you'll usually get, if it's something you shouldn't use, you'll get some pretty very clear hits about that.
Mhm. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Barbara.
Did you hand sew your dress or did you use a machine?
I did a little bit of both.
Oh,
Yeah, I started hand sewing and then realized why the sewing machine was invented. And then I was like, you know what? And I finished it with the machine. Yeah.
um, I'm a quilter, and Marianne is also a quilter, and she made a Jane Austen quilt,
Oh.
which would be great to see at some point. But there is one quilt that's her with her sisters, so it'd be interesting.
How lovely.
There is a quilt at Chawton House that supposedly was made by the Austen family. That looks like it's scraps of all kinds of things. So,
It looks like
anybody else? I will try to send out the list of places and that Ayana talked about in terms of where you could purchase or where you can have gowns made. One of my things I'd like to do before I die. And certainly we can get everybody dressed for some type of event, I hope. I'll be in contact with everyone about some ideas for that.
well, looks like we have a couple more questions.
Yeah. Any more questions, Sarah?
Yeah, hi. There are a couple of questions in the chat as well.
Uh-huh.
But Ayana, thank you. This was awesome. I was really struck by something you said at the beginning, which is that if you're interested in social history, wearing the clothes is a way of like sort of literally walking in someone else's shoes and getting to know a period better. And I guess I'd never formulated it to myself that succinctly. But these topics have always been really intriguing to me. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about your love of vintage fashion and history and so forth, how that has come about in your life.
Oh, probably since I was a little girl. I don't know if I'm extremely dating myself, but if anyone remembers the American Girl books.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. That was it. I think it got me. Ever since then, I've really just been drawn to history and learning about the past. And I think there's definitely a disconnect as far as social history, domestic history, and the types of history, at least in this country, that we learn in school. We tend to learn a lot of dates, a lot of wars, a lot of battles, and those are important, absolutely. But I found the lives of everyday people, particularly women, to be so interesting and so overlooked. I always wondered, and when I became a teacher, my students would always ask, yeah, we know about Darcy, but how did people go to the bathroom? They were very interested in what real life was like. And so I just began looking into it independently. And yeah, over the past few years, I've been so interested in the relationship between society and clothing. I think that doesn't get enough attention in historical circles and then also in fashion circles. So it does encompass those two things, and both fields, I feel, don't give it enough attention. People's clothing absolutely affected the way that they lived, and vice versa. All of these changes in society always bring about changes in clothing. My primary area of focus is early 20th century. And I remember I was writing a letter to my grandmother asking her about the 1940s. And, you know, what did you wear? What was it like? Is it like it is on TV? And she was like, I don't know about any of that, but I remember I got to wear pants. And she was just, that was what stuck out for her, you know, even these decades and decades later. And that was a huge change for just regular everyday women, wearing pants regularly, not just for yard work or something like that, to just wear them around. Of course, it was still informal and a little bit inappropriate, but way more than they would have in the previous decades. And I just think little things like that are so fascinating, that how changes going on that have nothing to do with you, made by all these you know, politicians, the monarchs of the world, stuff like that, definitely comes down and affects all of our lives as individuals. And
Mhm.
I think when you wear clothing from other periods, you really start to understand people a lot more. The comment in Pride and Prejudice that Caroline Bingley makes about Lizzie Bennet's muddy hem, you know, after she's walked all the way to Pem. Listen, I can tell you guys right now, wearing this dress, I've tripped at least 3 different times just to sit down in this chair. And so I think Caroline Bingley is being so hard on her. And you understand that more when you're wearing these clothes. You realize, okay, so it wasn't that Lizzie is this, you know, very unique heroine. It's just that she took a walk, a very regular everyday thing. And that when your skirts are this long and boots are for men, they're not for proper ladies, you kind of have a conundrum, and you're gonna have a dress that is disgusting by the time you get to where you're going. So I think it just gives so much context, and doesn't get talked about enough. Our relationship to clothing today is not nearly what it was in the past, where you kept something forever, where you mended things. You know, we don't have that. And I think there's definitely something that's a little bit lost.
Mhm.
Yeah, in understanding, I think, generations, when you can't have that relationship to your clothes, when it's not something that you keep forever, or at least for a long time. Um, you know, and seeing the changes that gradually progress, and things like that, I think it's just so interesting. And I would love to see more of it.
Mhm. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
We have some questions in the chat, I think.
Well, being old enough to have had to get dressed on Sunday wearing a hat and gloves and
Mhm.
all the undergarments that we had to wear when I was a child. Um, uh, it, I can appreciate the fact that complicated clothing really does make you behave differently. We're certainly all more comfortable now, but I agree with you. I think something is lost in people's deportment when they don't have to dress up. And something's missing from your life when you don't have occasions where you actually dress up. I mean, none of us need to go out in evening clothes, but certainly for the past year, it would have been nice to have some reason to get a little more dressed up and to go somewhere.
Absolutely. I
Mhm.
see a question in the chat
Are there
from
any more
Sandy.
questions? Well, I want to thank.
Oh, Andrea. I see people have been putting questions in the chat.
You know what? I can't access all the chat. If you
Okay, I can go through it.
Yeah, you can look and see if there are any more questions or remarks that people want to bring up.
I see a question from Sandy. Are Ayana's earrings historical? No, they are not. This is from a company called In the Long Run Designs. They are listed, they will be listed in the shopping list that will go out. Finding historical accessories from this far back is very tricky. That was one of the first things that, you know, people would lose. We lose our earrings now, right? So can you imagine only having one earring from your great, 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 great so-and-so? They don't come on the market too often. Question from Jameson. That earlier slide of the young Asian girl was new to me. I've seen paintings of wealthy families with African children as attendants or pages. Were Asian children similarly fashionable to some extent in paintings? Ooh, that's a good question. Yes, it was definitely on trend. Remember, we're having more and more influence of England across the globe in general. It's the sort of very beginning of that English imperialism. So it was very trendy to have servants from the countries that you were taking over. Let's sit with that uncomfortable thought for a second. But it was relatively trendy, yeah, to have yourself painted with your very trendy servant. However, Asians posed a little bit of a different social rank than African servants would have. Just because England's relationship to Asia was not quite the one that it was having with people of African descent. So you have a lot of differences there. We don't have the colonial grip that we see in the 19th century between Europe and Africa yet. It's not there yet. But we absolutely have that in Asia. So you have a lot of Asians coming to England of their own accord to try to, you know, gain opportunity, to just escape whatever's going on for them. Of course, if you're a runaway, maybe you're wanted in your home country, you could just hop on an English ship as a stowaway and boom, no one knows where you are. So it's just a little bit different. But there are a few paintings that will show Asian servants. Also, there has been recent evidence that says not all of these paintings that we see with, you know, sort of that stock white, wealthy gentry person and a similarly dressed person of color were not all servants. There's been a lot coming out that says, hey, maybe these two people were friends, maybe they were married, maybe they were a family member. And in order to have it be socially acceptable to be painted, often the artist would say, okay, yeah, I'll paint you, but we have to make this look a little more acceptable, and would absolutely take those liberties. And because it was so hard to find someone who would accurately portray the relationships, what you get is a lot of master-servant type images that may not necessarily have been so. And so there's been a lot of work lately to uncover the truth of those relationships. And we find a lot of paintings where, yes, for years and years, it's been thought that they were master and servant and were not. Probably most notably is Dido Bell Lindsay. If we are familiar with that portrait. For years and years, everyone thought it was Elizabeth Murray, the figure in the foreground, and her Black servant, and now we know they were cousins. So you have to dig deep, but they are there. There are definitely some images I found in doing this where I did see not so much Asian children, and I'm not sure why that is, I'll be honest, but it was definitely there, definitely a cool thing to do.
Okay, well, I think we'll turn it off there. I really appreciate a wonderful, wonderful presentation with beautiful illustrations. So took a lot of thought and organization, so I really appreciate it, Ayana.
Thank you.
It looks like there might be one other person with their hand up.
I'm sorry, somebody said something. Pia, Leah, you said something?
Oh, I said it looks like Lute might have her hand up.
Oh, I see. You're on the other page for me. Go ahead.
Well,
I just
unfortunately,
wanted to add one thing. I've been doing this since 1983 professionally, working in museums, working in theater, etc. And one thing I would like to share that might help mindset. In fact, that closet behind me is full of hand sewn gowns, 100% hand sewn, including the underwear, undergarments. But if someone wants to take this on, I would strongly recommend that they think of it in terms of not costume, but clothing. And you begin to avoid things like tripping when you sit down, and you begin to move correctly. You begin to sit and stand correctly. Just like we wear our own clothing and move very comfortably in our own time period, if we think of these not as costumes, not for theater, not for presentation, but to go to a ball, as I've done, in full panoply and 2-foot feathers on my head. And I never fell down, and I moved probably more elegantly than I do in 2021 clothing. But it's not costume, it's our clothes. And that helps you get into the mindset of a historical attitude in your own body to offer.
Okay, well, interesting observation. Okay, well, thank you very much for the Louisiana, for all the people who attended and anybody who showed an interest. I am going to send out Ayana's shopping list and recommendations as soon as I get them. And I thank everybody for coming today. The Louisiana Region members, I'll send you out an email with the business meeting and the announcement about our upcoming meeting in June, probably about sometime next week. So thank everybody very much for spending the afternoon with us. And again, thank you, Ayana. And I'm going to close out the meeting. Yes. Big round of applause for our speaker.
Andrea, I'm gonna stop the recording. If you could stay on a couple minutes.
Okay, so you'll send me the recording, all right? Because